Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here on weeks 4 and 5. And we'll be looking at Spinoza and Hegel, Engels, Marx, Nietzsche. I believe that's it, but we'll find out as we go through here. But you can see in the title there and in the announcement that was sent out what is included. But we'll start off with Spinoza. So for Spinoza, Spinoza's work, Ethics, is kind of his most famous work, and that's where everything that he has to say about love here comes from. The most important concept in Spinoza is the conatus, C-O-N-A-T-U-S. Conatus refers to a form of power that derives from the capacity to be affected. So essentially what that is, I'm just going to move here while I turn off this fan. Open the door because it's a little warm in here. So Spinoza, so the concept of conatus refers to the capacity to be affected, and that for Spinoza is kind of the central point. And he basically says that the greater capacity you have to be affected, the more power you have, and that everyone attempts to gain more power in life, and there are certain emotions that enhance one's power, primarily joy, and enhance one's ability to be, calm and collected enough to be affected by something. Whereas sadness is kind of the opposite affect, and sadness tends to reduce our ability to be affected and therefore reduce our power. Sadness and anger and a variety of other affects and emotions that reduce our power, according to him. So there's a lot of different ways to look at what he says about love here. I'm going to go over a few different ones. The first one is the suggested text, which is Lloyd's short overview called Spinoza and Love. And here he refers to the parts in part 3 of the Ethics, where Spinoza says that basically that passivity or passive affects basically mean that love turns into hate through jealousy. So he begins with a quote from part 3 where he argues that love turns to hate when one's beloved is believed to be as close or close with another, hate to the beloved and envy to the other. And then that passivity becomes love. Sorry, passivity means love becomes hate. And this can also happen through just circumstance. Quotes part 3's assertion that our love for our past loves because of our love for our past loves, we tend to wish for the same circumstances that made it possible initially, rather than adapting to new circumstances and finding new aspects to love within love. Meaning that we kind of idealize and romanticize the past in love. And so he argues that usually love is passive rather than active. And for Spinoza, as also with Nietzsche and many of the thinkers that we'll read throughout the rest of the class, because you could say that Spinoza is kind of a turning point here, because Spinoza is kind of one of the fundamental bases for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is one of the fundamental bases for especially all the stuff that we looked at for week 6, radical philosophy of love from the 60s through the 90s. Through the 80s primarily. But all of that is sort of like a left, pro-sexual minority, pro-women form of radical philosophy of sex and love. And all of that takes from Nietzsche and ultimately from Spinoza this idea of affirmation and of active affects or active passions rather than passive ones. So passive passions or the sad passions, which is like sadness, anger, and that kind of thing. These tend to turn love into hate, whereas active love or nobility would destroy hate. And as I mentioned, the conatus refers to passions that control us versus affections that we control. Affections that we control, in other words, the active passions, are what Spinoza is working towards. It's what he's trying to think of how we can focus on that. So affections that we're in control of are the hinge of the central question for Spinoza, which is that given that all finite modes or all human beings seek to increase their flourishing, and given that all finite beings are in a continuously changing network of other finite beings, the affects of joy and sadness depend heavily on our ideas of the affects of others. So if we imagine another person to be, especially a beloved, to be sad, that will cause sadness within us. If we imagine them to be joyful, that will cause joy within us. So when we imagine an affect in another's body, this causes the same affect in our own, such as when, the famous quote from Camus, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, pushing the stone kind of endlessly up, over and over, up the hill. That we must imagine Sisyphus happy. We can also imagine ourselves happy, even though we might be just engaged in kind of the same type of task over and over and over throughout our lives. So, so by imagining someone else happy, we ourselves become happy. And for Spinoza, love is defined as love is defined as the awareness of a significant transition in the direction of joy. So as we become move closer to joy, love is that's what for Spinoza would be love. And this, especially in the case of love, this derives from an external cause, another finite being or human being that we strive to have present to us. And in short, this means that, quote, we find a person helpful to preserving our being, we thereby strive to preserve the beloved as well. The internal-external side of this is that the love object is simultaneously internal and external to us, and we to it, in that it agrees with our nature and yet remains partially external nevertheless. And similarly, our nature agrees with their nature, and we remain partially external to them. But for Spinoza, sharing love is not possible without mutual loss. So when the beloved denies full possession, the other is diminished, and love wanes or becomes complicated by what he calls excretions excreted by the beloved. In other words, when we begin to encounter the fullness of the other person who we love, and the many-sidedness and the multiplicity of the other person, very often this results in the waning of love, or at least a feeling of declined interest, or that sort of thing. And whether or not relationship lasts or not has a lot to do with whether this diminishment that comes from realizing the kind of fullness of the other person is tolerable for both parties or not. So as a result of that, according to Spinoza, we feel that we're in bondage to a beloved that we do not entirely love, and yet at the same time we also feel that we do entirely love the other, and it creates this paradoxical effect, and that very often becomes a make it or break it kind of paradox. So this is where for Spinoza, and Spinoza was one of the kind of classical rationalists, although he's a very different type of rationalist than other rationalists of his time. But but this is where reason enters, and here the finite being's reflection on this combination of both pain and desire in love. What it does is it severs the ties of desirous love, which is just sort of shallow erotic love, and leads the lovers in many cases to search again for the love for other loves, or for the love of existence as such, which could be a love of God or a love of knowledge, or something like that. And but basically seeking not finite love, but rather infinite love, infinite love, or what Spinoza calls geometric love rather than desirous love. So essentially what this means is that we end up reorienting love towards the infinite and treat short-term love as exactly what it is, which is short-term love. Short-term meaning finite. And again, for Spinoza constantly refers to living things as finite beings, in the sense that we're all short timers. We rarely live beyond 100 years and that kind of thing. So moving on to Deleuze on Spinoza, here he juxtaposes affection versus affect, and emphasizes that they're two different things. And he says that an idea is a mode of thought which represents something, like a triangle, while an affect is just a mode of thought that doesn't represent anything. So an affect could be kind of like an emotion, like pain or love, and it doesn't necessarily represent any other thing other than its actual self. So if you feel pain, you feel it directly, and it doesn't represent some other thing, the way that the word triangle would represent the kind of pure form of a triangle that you could describe through geometry or something like that. But pain or love or will are non-representational affects in and of themselves. So they're fundamentally different from ideas in that respect. Now, in order to love or to have an affect, it's you have to have an idea of the beloved, a representation of what is loved. So the affect of love becomes conjoined to an idea. And in Spinoza, the idea is primary and it's above affect. Affect isn't reducible to the idea, but affect does presuppose the idea, even though it's not reducible to it. So in the second section of this, Deleuze goes on to say that for Spinoza, the conatus is the increase or decrease of the power of acting, which corresponds to a ruling affect or passion, which might be joy or sadness and that kind of thing. And this is what I was saying a second ago about how joy increases our power of acting because our increased capacity to be affected also increases our capacity to affect the world. So, for example, if you were going on a job search and you knew absolutely nothing about the world of business, or you knew nothing about what types of jobs are plentiful versus which ones are not plentiful, then you very well might not know enough. And if you don't have an interest in learning those things, then you may end up doing very poorly in the job market. And that's because your capacity to be affected by information is diminished for whatever reason it might be. It might just be that you don't care, or it might be that you've lost hope, or it might be who knows what the reason would be. But in one way or another, your capacity to be affected by that information is diminished, and therefore your power to act is diminished because you're not even aware of how things work. And maybe as a result of that, you didn't really do much of a job search. And as a result of not doing much of a job search, you don't even know what's out there. And as a result of not knowing what's out there, you don't apply for things. And obviously, if you don't apply for things, you don't get the job. So that's the conatus. The conatus is an increased power, increased capacity to be affected by the world. And the more you can be affected by the world, the more you can affect the world, according to Spinoza. You could also think of this in terms of empathy. And if you think of it that way, it's a very different definition of power than we're used to thinking of. So, all right, so let's move on. Deleuze goes on and says, yet again, Spinoza denounces a plot in the universe of those who are interested in affecting us with sad passions. The priest has the need of the sadness of his subjects. He needs these subjects to feel themselves to be guilty. Um, so those who want to affect us or infect us with sad passions usually are doing that because they want you to be less powerful so that they can be more powerful over you, according to Deleuze. And but the important thing is that the active affects rather than passive affects can help us to fight that kind of situation. So we can leave behind inadequate ideas about things, inadequate representations of the world, by embracing the active affects, those connecting with the power of acting rather than the continuous variations of just random desires and that kind of thing. But to actually have a kind of mental map of the world and its contents, so that we can be more selective in what we seek out. Um, and he goes on and talks about ethics versus morality. He says, Spinoza is very distinct, and this is where he links into Nietzsche, and Deleuze actually says that. So he says Spinoza doesn't ask what we must do, so that's why it's not a moral question in the ethics. Spinoza doesn't ask what we must do. He always asks what we're capable of, what's in our power. Ethics is a problem of power, never a problem of duty. What he comprehends are good encounters, bad encounters, increases and diminutions of power. Thus, he makes an ethics and not at all a morality. And this is why he so struck Nietzsche. So he's one of the very first to just really make everything a matter of power, but defining power in a way that is not, not necessarily about domination or exploitation or anything of the sort, but is rather about one's own capacity to be affected by the world. And you could think of that in a very non-exploitative manner, obviously, if you think about it. So typically we don't possess the power of acting, even in joy, because we remain within the passions. And the point is to go beyond the passions eventually, but only certain affections can, certain affects have the capacity to allow us to do that. So this is, so he talks about affection ideas, which is a mixture of another body's power on my power. But he says that a notion idea is different. A notion idea instead represents the internal agreement or disagreement of the characteristics relations of two bodies. So if you have two bodies, two human beings, the question there is not necessarily mixing another's power with your power, or mixing your power with somebody else's power, but instead trying to think carefully and, in a complex manner, to what extent does this other person agree or disagree with my internal characteristics, and vice versa. Do my internal characteristics benefit and complement the other person's? So that would kind of help you to think about whether you actually want to pursue a relationship with that person. So this for Spinoza is a kind of rationality. And he says that notion ideas of this kind they're rational, they're comprehension based, and they're not passion based. So for example, he gives the example of arsenic in the human body. So obviously the arsenic will kill the human. So therefore it doesn't agree with your body. And if you know this, then you avoid it. If you don't know that, then you might not avoid it and you might die. So, and he says, arsenic undergoes a joyful passion because, as Spinoza says so well, each body has a soul. Thus the arsenic is joyful, but me, evidently I'm not. It has induced the parts of my body to enter into a relation which is combined with my own, the arsenics. Me, I'm sad. I'm heading towards death. You see that the notion, if one can reach it, is a formidable thing. So reaching the notion is very important to one's own survival, to one's own flourishing. And it's not just a matter of cycling through these different affects and emotions of, from sadness to joy, but to actually reaching the level of reason and kind of abstracting enough and gaining enough knowledge to know that that you might not want to drink arsenic, for example. Now, Now he goes on and says that if you could comprehend everything, then you would know by causes instead of just knowing only by effects separated from their causes. If you have no sense of the relationship between cause and effect, then you're just going to go based off of experience, and you're not necessarily going to have a good time with that. Um, so he says at that moment, I would just have an adequate idea. I would have an adequate idea. Just as if I understood why someone pleases me, I took as an example digestive relations, but we wouldn't have to change a line for amorous relations. It's not at all that Spinoza conceived love like he conceived digestion. He conceived digestion like he conceived love as well. So, so having an adequate idea of the other is um, very central to being able to um, uh, is very central to knowing whether it's worth pursuing love, for example. Um, so mad love or bad love, or as Lady Gaga had it, bad romance, is one in which sadness, which indicates that something disagrees with one's nature, takes hold and becomes the reigning affect. Um, and uh, Spinoza basically is saying that sadness makes no one intelligent. In sadness, one is going to be unhappy or wretched, and it's for this reason that power needs its subjects to be sad. It needs the powerful need us to all be sad, um, because sadness decreases our intelligence. It decreases our vivacity, and as long as you have a sad affect, a body is acting on yours. Uh, uh, Quoting Deleuze here, he says, a soul acts on yours in conditions and in a relation which does not agree with yours. At that point, nothing in sadness can induce you to form the common notion, that is to say, the idea of something in common between two bodies and two souls. Um, so he's opposed to he's opposed to kind of focusing on death, and uh, basically says that philosophy should be a meditation on life, should be a meditation on affirmation, should be a meditation on the joyful passions, because the joyful passions are the ones that increase our power to act, and death is more of a bad encounter, obviously. So so almost all passions are sad passions for Spinoza. There's only a few of them that are closer to joy, and the affect of joy is what allows us to reach the notion idea and the common idea. And um, Deleuze says that the list of sad passions in Spinoza is infinite. He goes so far as to say that every idea of reward envelops a sad passion. Every idea of security envelops a sad passion. Every idea of pride and of guilt. It's one of the most marvelous moments in the ethics. The affects of joy are like a springboard. They make us pass through something that we would never have been able to pass if there had only been sadness. He solicits us to form the idea of what is common to the affecting body and to the affected body. This can fail, but it can also succeed and allow us to become intelligent. Um, so he goes on and says that Spinoza doesn't think like most rationalists. He's very different from most of them. It's not only the world of reason and the ideas. Spinoza thinks that being reasonable or being wise is a problem of becoming, which changes the contents of the concept of reason. So he's still a rationalist, but he's a rationalist who's concerned with becoming and with change and transformation. So it's necessary to know the encounters, the types of encounters that agree with your nature, and um, so. And he goes on and says, the most beautiful thing is to live on the edges at the limit of his own power of being affected, on the condition that this be the joyful limit, since there is the limit of joy and the limit of sadness. But everything which exceeds your power of being affected is ugly, relatively ugly. What's good for flies is not inevitably good for you. So everybody is different, and therefore, in everyone's unique differences, we have qualities that make us able to resonate with other people or not resonate with other people. So he talks about also a decomposition of relations and composition of relations in bad love and in good love. So in bad love, the decomposition of relations. This comes from Spinoza's letters to somebody named Bleinberg, in which a basely sensual appetite, meaning like a desire just for sex, leads to a desire for a bad woman who can only bring bad love or bad romance. But for Spinoza, this isn't really a moral problem. It's something I can do. It's a virtue. It's an expression of power. So, you can, for him, you can go ahead and have the sex, but there's still, the real question is not whether it's moral, but whether it will really lead to an increase in your mutual power or not. So, for example, if the other person is married, this can cause problems in their marriage. If you're married, it can cause problems in your marriage, and it can cause a decomposition of relations that maybe you don't want. So, whether it's moral or not is for Spinoza is beside the point. What the real question is do you want your marriage to unravel or not? And if not, then maybe you shouldn't do it. Okay. Also, composition of relations, which is the opposite of that, comes from what he calls the most beautiful of loves. So, in the most beautiful of loves, my action, exactly the same, my physical action, my bodily action, is associated with an image of the thing whose relation is directly combined with the relation of my action. It's in this sense that the two uniting individuals lovingly form a third individual, which has both of them as parts. On the contrary, in the basely sensual love, meaning just pure erotic love, the one destroys the other destroys the one. There's a whole process of decomposition of relations. In short, they make love like they are knocking each other about. But also importantly, for Spinoza, none of this is a matter of free will. Same thing with Nietzsche. And that's part of why both of them are not concerned with morality, they're concerned with ethics. So, because if you notice in a lot of Christian theology, there's the argument that God gave us free will. And so if God gave us free will, that means that often is implied to mean that that we have an infinite number of choices, but the choices we could make are either good choices or evil choices. So if you make evil choices, then you're out of luck and you're going to go to hell. But for Spinoza and Nietzsche, that's a Christian moral hierarchy, and that's not the way that they think. They think not in terms of free will, but in more structural terms. So Spinoza says that thinking that one can choose to not have a basely sensual desire, that one cannot choose to be erotically excited in a situation that might not be the best situation, and can instead just choose the most beautiful of loves, is like saying that a stone is deprived of sight. In other words, it's idealism, and it misses the fact that things are often beyond our control, and that in many cases, the most beautiful of loves may not actually appear for an individual person. It just depends, of course. So he says that the blind man is deprived of nothing. He is as perfect as can be according to the affections of his power, the images of which he is capable. And that there's nothing wrong with not being capable of higher loves or anything like that. There's nothing morally wrong with it. There might be something practically wrong with it in terms of like how your life turns out as a result. Okay, so Deleuze thinks that Bleinberg's rejection of Spinoza is correct because it ignores duration. So Bleinberg says you cannot expel the phenomenon of duration. This is duration. It's precisely according to this that you can become better. There's a becoming, and it's according to this duration that you can become better or worse. So you don't just have to act on a basely sensual appetite. You can choose to not do that, and you can choose to seek the most beautiful of loves, for example. And then Deleuze goes on and returns to this idea that powerful people construct their power on imposing sadness on others or inculcating sadness in others, and also on inculcating base sensual desires. And whereas the task is to build a society based on a higher form of love. So just to give you a little bit of the quote here, he says, "The people of power are the impotent who can only construct their power on the sadness of others. They need sadness. They can only reign over slaves, and the slave is precisely the regime of the decrease of power. There are people who can only reign, who can only acquire power by way of sadness, and by instituting a regime of sadness of the type repent, of the type hate someone, and even if you don't have anyone to hate, then you can hate yourself at least, that kind of thing." And so everything that Spinoza diagnoses as a kind of culture of sadness, all of this says that if you don't pass by way of sadness, you won't flourish. But for Spinoza, that's completely not true. You have to pass by way of joy to flourish. For Spinoza, it's completely the opposite of this framework. So he writes. In order to say no. Actually, good equals joy, bad equals sadness, and the most, basely sensual appetites or desires, meaning just direct erotic love, and the most beautiful of loves, is not a spiritual thing. It's nor is it a moral thing. It's a matter of what functions well. So is there, can you function with somebody whose nature does not agree with yours? And that's really what it comes down to for Spinoza. And that's kind of his philosophy of love is both partners increasing their power mutually, together increasing their capacity to be affected, and therefore their mutual capacity to affect, and that includes with each other. Because obviously, if you can't be affected by the other person, then you don't really know the state that the other person is in. They don't know the state that you're in, and you're not going to have very good communication in the relationship, and therefore it's not going to be that great of a relationship. So, but he does, he's aware that there are always, smaller sadnesses and that kind of thing. But the question isn't whether there is or isn't. It's whether the value that you give them and how much you're focused on a love of joy or a happy love. So, all right, and he ends it by talking about pantheism and the love of God. But that part's really not that relevant. But just for a minute, if you wonder what that is, pantheism is the belief in Spinoza's metaphysics is pretty much this basic idea, I guess. It's pretty close to pantheism. Pantheism is the argument that there is no second substance. There's only one substance. So in many theologies, there is a distinction between primary substance and secondary substance. So primary substance would mean, for example, all substance of the earth, of the universe, of primary reality, and then the secondary substance of God and the divine, which is seen as a completely different thing. Most forms of Christianity, almost all religions, divide existence into these two divine versus non-divine forms of substance. But Spinoza is a monist, which means that he argues that there's only one substance, and that the earth itself is God, is divine. The universe is God, is divine. And that also means by implication that there is no personified God. There's no being called God, and God is not a creator for pantheists either. Existence itself is creative for pantheists, but it's not God in the traditional religious sense. Okay, so moving on to Spinoza himself, just to quote a few things that he says here. He says, he who conceives that the object of his love is affected pleasurably or painfully will himself be affected painfully or pleasurably or painfully, and the one or the other emotion will be greater or lesser in the lover according as it is greater or lesser in the thing loved. So in other words, we become, when you love somebody, you're hurt by the fact that they are hurt, if they are hurt, and vice versa. Um, and much of what he says in this section is about this type of empathy and this kind of deep connection that you establish with somebody else. So he goes on, another one of the aphorisms is, if we conceive that anything pleasurably affects some object of our love, we shall be affected with love towards that thing. Contrariwise, if we conceive that it affects an object of our love painfully, we should be affected with hatred towards it. Okay, he keeps saying similar things to this quite a bit. He goes on and says, when we love a thing similar to ourselves, we endeavor as far as we can to bring it about that it shall love us in return. And okay, if a man has begun to hate an object of his love so that love is thoroughly destroyed, he will cause his being equal, regard it with more hatred than if he had never loved it, and his hatred will be in proportion to the strength of his former love. So, so if we lose a love, we might end up hating them, and we might hate them just as strongly as we love them, in fact. Because, which kind of implies something that Nietzsche will say when we get to Nietzsche in a minute here, which kind of implies that love and hatred are conjoined in many respects. So he goes on and says, hatred is increased by being reciprocated. On the other hand, can be destroyed, but on the other hand, can be destroyed by love. Hatred, which is completely vanquished by love, passes into love, and love is thereupon greater than if hatred had not preceded it. Whenever I read that part of Spinoza, I can't help but think of Martin Luther King, which kind of makes sense because King read Nietzsche a great deal, and Nietzsche read Spinoza a great deal. So there is a direct connection that way. Moving on to Hegel. So in this short fragment from Hegel, he's basically critiquing Christianity and other forms of religious descriptions of love as saying that they are incomplete, they're not truly cosmopolitan, they imagine a unity of opposites and of different people through, say, religious conversion, but they're always still basically partial. They don't really imagine unifying, the entire human race. And while he concedes that Christianity was less exclusive than prior religions to it, or other religions, it nevertheless sorts the world into believers and non-believers, and therefore is not truly cosmopolitan and is not truly up to what the modern world needs in Hegel's belief system. So he says, instead of religion, he argues in favor of unconditional love as humanity as such, and unconditional there meaning that you don't have to be a Christian to be considered human or to be loved. In fact, you don't have to be anything. You don't have to have any prerequisites to be worthy of love. And so he says that he raises the question of what is true union, or what is true love. And for him, true union or love proper exists only between living things who are alike in power, and thus in one another's eyes, living beings from every point of view. In no respect is either dead for the other. This genuine love excludes all oppositions. It is not the understanding whose relations always leave the manifold of related terms as a manifold, and whose unity is always a unity of opposites. It's not reason either, because reason sharply opposes its determining power to what is determined. Love neither restricts nor is restricted. Love is not finite. It's a feeling, not a single feeling, because it's shared by a wide variety of people. And the whole of life is not contained in love in the same way as it is in the sum of its many particular and isolated feelings. In love, life is present as a duplicate of itself and as a single and unified self. Here, life has run through the circle of development from an immature to a complete mature unity. And in essence, what he's saying here through all of this language um, is that love requires that everybody be equal in power, more or less, um, and that you can't really have unequal power relations and have actual love. And this goes for individual love relationships as much as it does, say, like a politics of love or love-based politics. Uh, all of that requires equality and uh, mutual liberty and that sort of thing. This is one of the places where, although it's in Spinoza too, but this is one of the places where uh, romantic and sexual love gives way to political love and the image of love as a form of politics or as a basis for politics. In this case, the basis is basically love of the neighbor, and therefore uh, a form of cosmopolitanism uh, and thinking beyond nation states and that kind of thing. So, okay, Marx is the Holy Family. This starts out with a critique of French socialism, that of Fleury Tristan, and constructing formulae out of the categories of what exists, meaning the existing Hegelian philosophy and the existing social aspirations. For Marx, Hegel is a figure that needs to be turned on its head, as he famously put it. In many ways, Hegel was a revolutionary philosopher, but not really politically in quite the way that Marx was, but definitely was a important philosopher. But for Marx, he's somebody that we need to go back to and pull the good parts out and kind of dispose of the rest. So he then moves on to a critique of Barreau on prostitutes. He says that Barreau only criticizes the police commissioner's view as expressive of the police point of view while not presenting its own point of view. And then finally, we arrive at the central part that I wanted you to read here, which is the section called Love. And here, French socialism, which Marx is critiquing, seeks to dispose of love because it's a passion. And Marx feels that this is ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with passion for Marx. And he says that this is the reason that love is often presented as female, as a goddess, and since love is figured as apart from man, it then is seen as the negation of man and an alienation of human nature. But Marx is basically pro-love in this case, and he criticizes French socialist thought on love as being anti-love and anti-material, because Marx's philosophy, unlike Hegel's, is materialist, which means that it, idealism tends to think in terms of kind of grand ideals and not really paying super close attention to actual material conditions that people are faced with, but thinking more ideally. And so this is one thing that Marx has in common with Spinoza and also with Nietzsche, which is that they all, in various ways, are much more interested in actual material existing social situations. So, for example, when I was saying earlier that Spinoza isn't concerned with morality, he's concerned with ethics. What that means is that he's concerned with the question of, like, what is the best thing to do in a situation, in an actual situation, not what is the sort of abstract idea of what is good and what is evil. So okay, all right. So Marx criticizes French socialist thought on love as being anti-object, as being anti-material. And he says that Edgar criticizes love as focusing on an object, since the beloved is important to the lover only as an external object of the soul's emotion. But Marx argues that there's nothing wrong with the objects of affection. Marx argues in favor of what you might call a materialist love, quote, which first really teaches man to believe in the objective world outside himself, which not only makes man into an object, but even the object into a man. but love is an uncritical, unchristian materialist. So this is a really important point here in Marx, in Marx's philosophy of love. Um, he says that love is important because through love, it's very often the first time that we're able to really believe in the materially existing world and of the necessity of taking care of it and of taking care of other people and of being concerned for our fellow human beings and not only ourselves, and not in an idealist sort of abstract way, of love for all humanity per se, although that I think you would argue in favor of that too, but not quite like Hegel would, because Hegel is an idealist, and so his idea of materialist love is that if you're in a direct love relationship, you understand the other person, you care for the other person in their actual embeddedness in the world, their embeddedness in a very specific type of situation that you have the ability to affect positively or to affect negatively. That's why he's saying that love is an uncritical, unchristian materialist, um, because love is what first allows us to believe in the objective world beyond our individual selves. And finally, Marx criticizes French socialist thought as anti-individual, because even though people don't know this about Marx, many people don't know this about Marx, Marx was one of the most robust thinkers of individual freedom that we've seen ever in Western philosophy. But so here he's criticizing kind of anti-individual forms of socialism and arguing in favor of individual freedom. So he says, love even makes one human being this external object of the emotion of the soul of another, the object in which the selfish feeling of the other finds its satisfaction, a selfish feeling because it looks for its own essence in the other, and that must not be. Critical criticism is so freed from all selfishness, and he's being sarcastic here. Critical criticism, meaning this French socialist tradition that he's criticizing, critical criticism is so free from all selfishness that for it, the whole range of human essence is exhausted by its own self. So he's very humorous in his style of writing, and again he is in favor of individual freedom, and that's the reason he frames it that way in that part. Okay, moving on to Engels' Origin of the Family. So this was written after Marx's death, and basically Engels went back to Marx's notes. He took very extensive notes on Lewis Henry Morgan, who was an anthropologist who was adopted into the Seneca tribe and who lived amongst the Iroquois in North America. And the reason for this is that Marx was looking for evidence of what he called primitive communism, because in Marx's kind of political philosophy, he imagines there being many different stages that originate with primitive communism, meaning in kind of old tribal societies, there was a form of property held in common rather than being individually owned, and that this could be seen as a form of communism. That after all the different stages of economic systems, from mercantilism to feudalism to capitalism, and through all these different stages, and finally to socialism, and then to communism, that essentially with primitive communism, we have evidence that humans have at one point lived in a state of communism. And if you read anthropologists like Marshall Stallings, he basically argues that this is the vast majority of human history, actually, and modern civilization in the last couple thousand years is just a very short portion of human existence, and that really for most of our existence we lived in states of primitive communism. So Marx was looking for evidence of that. And so what Engels is doing here is kind of helping him to complete that project by writing a book on the origins of the family and how modern Western bourgeois, meaning kind of upper class, capitalist notions of love. Um, how this inflects our understanding of familiar relations, how it inflects our understanding of private property in the state, how our current conception of the family is just one of many alternate systems that have existed at different places and different times in very different ways. So he wrote this based upon, like I said, Marx's notes on Henry Morgan, and he's trying to show that love and sex and familiality had different histories that could still be drawn upon in the future for future communist notions of love, which would be very different. So he argues that for example, in Morgan's writings on the Iroquois, sons and daughters are not simply the sons and daughters of their direct fathers, but are also considered to be the sons and daughters of their father's brother, which for us would be an uncle. But in different societies and different types of family organization, every child would have more than one father and more than one mother. And he also talks about how tribal societies had group marriage, and they had essentially free love. So men would live in polygamy, women would live in polyandry, meaning multiple husbands, and their common children are considered common to everybody together. This is especially in the case of the Punaluen family in Hawaii, but also in other cultures as well. And so he says that humans have already invented polyandry. They've already invented non-monogamy, and examples of these things are also throughout nature. In fact, he says, quote, "Examples of faithful monogamy amongst birds prove nothing about man, for the simple reason that men are not descended from birds." And then he goes on and does find an example from animals, and he says, "And if strict monogamy is the height of all virtue, then the palm must go to the tapeworm, which has a complete set of male and female sexual organs in all of its 50 to 200 proglottides or sections, and spends its whole life copulating in all its sections with itself. Confining ourselves to mammals, however, we find all forms of sexual life, promiscuity, indications of group marriage, polygyny, monogamy, polyandry alone is lacking, and it took human beings to achieve that." And we do find that in the Punaluen family in Hawaii. All right, so to wrap up this particular lecture, we're going to move on to Nietzsche and the joyous science. So this is a series of aphorisms, and a little bit like Spinoza's, but a little bit less systematic than Spinoza. So he starts out by critiquing the distinction of avarice and love, and he argues that enmity or hatred or avarice is not really the opposite of love. It's conjoined with love in various ways. They're two sides of the same desire, and the former comes forth, for example, when a love is lost, but still amounts to the same overall phenomena. And he really questions whether whether these things can be seen truly as opposites. He says, love thy neighbor is really a means of, he's being a bit cynical here. He says that love thy neighbor is really a means of seeking a new property, since we grow bored of the beloved and we seek more possessions, more love possessions, which means that ultimately that we also grow bored of ourselves and the way that we have developed within a relationship. Therefore, we seek to become more than we are in that situation, and seek out other relationships. Then the lover contemplates the deprivation and ruin of all rivals. And so Nietzsche here is rejecting the idea that love is the opposite of selfishness. He says, actually, love is the most candid expression of selfishness. In fact, love is very selfish. But when people are talking about selfless love, what they're usually really talking about for Nietzsche is friendship, not love. And exalting love as unselfish is kind of foolish, and it's not very real, actually. Nevertheless, though, Nietzsche, is not claiming to be a realist. He doesn't, he doesn't argue um, against passion or fantasy. He doesn't claim that love is free of passion or blindness. That it's sober. He argues uh, that there's no reality for anyone, not for Nietzscheans and not for realists either. Um, but he does say that love is forgiving. He says love forgives the lover even his lust, and I think this comes from Nietzsche's kind of materialist understanding of love. That you can't separate love from lust. You can't separate love from selfishness. That all of these things are really fundamentally conjoined. Um, so those are the main parts of Nietzsche and of the other readings that I wanted you to understand, and that will be drawn upon in the test. And in the next lecture, we'll go through the remaining readings. All right.